time for another round of Brandy. Candid conversations over cocktails about all things brand with your hosts, Reilly Newman and Scott Saunders, the brand developers behind Motif Brands.
Scott, we've been asked a lot about why Brandy?
Like why do we
name?
call the show Brandy? Why
the topics? Why the name? Why the cocktails?
Because we love cocktails.
It was an excuse.
No, I've been asked that too, and it comes down to we wrote a book, and it's on Amazon and it's kind of doing really well. So from there, Brandy the podcast show was kind of birthed, and it's a continuation, but it's made to accompany it. If you're big on these episodes, check out the book, and if you've bought the book and are now checking out the podcast, great, because a lot of it is that they go hand in hand.
Yeah, it's a nice companion, an audio companion to the written word that we spent.
The written word. Careful, we're getting
of Brandy, and it's carrying over the concept of we like. I think it's taking complex things that we've articulated and spent a lot of time thinking on, and then casually either talking about them here on the podcast or more casually written.
So enough about that, but it leads itself into a book, right? And the topic of the book leads into what we kind of want to touch on today, I think, right, Reilly, is the power of narrative in and brand, how they work hand in hand.
Yeah.
And how a brand has a narrative, needs a narrative, and in some cases, how the narrative can be so strong and great that it becomes a brand in and of itself.
Yeah, and I feel like we kind of started going this direction when we were talking about stories, because you and I we love video games, we love movies, we both read, and we were just talking about we were talking about just the fact of stories and how some of these great, famous stories, whether it's Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, or even The Simpsons or Mario, all these incredible stories have gone out to then become really household brands in of themselves. Yeah. And so then we were talking about stories and how that applies to business brands or even a small business brand and that driving force behind it. And I think both of us kind of agree that the narrative, how those stories are told, the art of telling that story. It's great to have a story, but really the art and the nuance of telling that story is what really is going to drive it forward.
Right. It gives legs. I think a narrative gives legs to a brand. It gives there's sturdy table legs. It gives the brand something to foundation.
Yeah. For
the brand to rest on and to connect with the audience. Which then, if we go back to our episode our last episode where we talked about the phases of brand, right?
Yeah.
That taking it from that love to ownership, that's fandom.
Yeah.
And we talked about various brands that have pretty big fandoms, right? Corporations, Apple being one of them, right? There's the diehards that will, day one of a release of some new product, they are waiting in line and dropping, a lot and to buy the latest thing, right? To always stay on top of that. When the interesting transition of having the narrative that can take a brand and connect it with its audience. Sometimes that narrative is birthed from the brand or is derived from the brand's service or product offering. Or it can be something that is outside of the brand and aligns with something of value with the audience. Mm-hmm. And as long as you're connecting with the audience, directly or indirectly, with some narrative, that's how you're going to make that emotional connector with your audience, with your consumer.
Yeah, and I like the word narrative because to me it does sum up the perspective of it. And like you said, making that connection is that whether it is Lord of the Rings telling a story from the perspective of Frodo or a Hobbit in The Hobbit or Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, or even like a video game or a movie that takes a perspective of a certain character. And then we've seen, other extensions of that where they take the perspective of another character in that story to show the other side of the story itself. And I think, like you said, connecting to the audience, or a brand connecting to their audience, just like Apple or Starbucks or Target does, by they tell their story, but from a certain narrative that actually resonates, that specifically resonates with that either tech enthusiast or, you know, the mom who likes to shop at Target. You're telling the story and you're actually resonating with them because the narrative, you've deliberately chosen how to tell the story.
Right.
You're not just telling it.
Exactly. Like, and it can be as subtle as REI celebrates the great outdoors, the sense of adventure that comes from an uncharted territory, whatever that means to you, whether it's that mountain trail you've never taken or going to the beach dunes and seeing what the day presents itself.
Yeah.
It's out. Yeah. It's that sense of adventure, and they embody that in their brand. In a similar way that like Bass Pro Shop, right, does, but those type of outdoor brands that connect with their audience, and it so when people come in that are into that lifestyle, they naturally gravitate towards REI because REI and other brands communicate to the consumer that they embrace the spirit of the great outdoors, or that maybe it's it's outdoor conservation is important
like
to the brand. And if I'm into being outdoors and all, and outdoor conservation is important to me, it's a cause that means a lot to me, and the brand is conveying that it means a lot to them. Well, outdoor conservation may have absolutely nothing to do with their specific product they're selling me or their service that they're selling me, but it's something that's attached to the brand. It's a narrative that's attached. And a narrative could be as simple as a one word or a simple sentence. It doesn't have to be a lengthy, lengthy once upon a time type of narrative, right? Like it would be like the history of the company, which in many cases is endearing. It's cute. It's fun, right? Every company that is, especially companies that have been started and passed down through the generations, there's tons of companies that started that boast that they start, 1963, we've been blah, 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 right? Because it's a generational company that's been around for a long time and established, and that's great. But there were a lot of companies that were birthed in the 60s that could all make that same claim. So you can't rest on that. That's not endearing enough. Yeah. But if people know the story of, say, Apple and Steve Jobs and the garage and where he started the company and stuff, and they know that story just enriches. It acts as a little bit more of a binder to the brand. But when all's said and done, Apple isn't the massive empire it is simply because of its story. It's because of its products and its innovation that was derived from its story.
Well, and on Apple, I would almost say it's like there's a story, which is like a history, but the narration that they chose, how to tell that story. And again, it's like the narrative deliberately chose certain things to hit upon because those are attributes and principles of the brand. Just like you mentioned, Patagonia, REI, and Bass Pro Shop, all of them have the story of the outdoors, but the narration that they've chosen per brand is different. Bass Pro Shop, much more hunting and fishing focus. I wouldn't see Patagonia having that same narrative because Patagonia has played more of the conservation, hiking, outdoorsy, that vibe and that narrative, even though both of them are really taken from the same story. It's like, it reminds me of even like, Wizard of Oz versus Wicked, is that you have one story, but you have two totally different perspectives. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it, where you can take a story about either an industry or a market or even just the lifestyle that someone's living, your consumer or your audience, and then approach it from a certain narrative that's going to align with even a sub-segment of that audience. And again, some of these brands that you have, in your house have done that, where they've aligned with a very certain audience, and through that deliberate approach has made them successful.
Yeah. And even as we're talking about narratives, we're talking about story, it's interesting to note that there are intellectual properties out there that are solely based on story, whether it's from comic books, whether it's from novels like Hunger Games, or it's from TV shows, dramas like something like Stranger Things.
Yeah.
You mentioned The Simpsons. or Star Wars, all these great Wizard of Oz, any of these types of things that literally birth the fandoms on epic levels, where they're buying. You can put that story, that story brand on anything, and it would sell. It would sell. You could slap Homer Simpson on a Yankee candle, and Simpson fans are going to buy up that Yankee candle because it's got Homer Simpson on it, regardless of whether they like the smell of vanilla or not. Or you take an enterprise like Disneyland and Walt Disney, and when he even opened the doors for Disneyland, that wasn't the birth of Disney. Yeah. Birth goes back to an endearing story called Steamboat Willie with a little, animated mouse, Mickey, and that took off. And Mickey Mouse and his stories and the world he created with, Daffy and Goofy and Pluto and all the, that led to building Disney. So when he opens up Disneyland and you've got Mickey Mouse greeting guests, that was the fandom of the mouse, and why one of the hugely global recognized symbol icon is those mouse ears. Three circles put together, three ellipses slightly put together. It's as magnetic of a brand icon as the Nike swoosh, the Golden Arches, or a bite out of an apple.
Yeah. Like you said, the story of it that's backing it, and that's what people want to be part of. It's like you pay for Mickey Mouse, you pay for Disneyland because you want a part of that story, but most importantly, you want the narrative. You want, really, is Disneyland and Disney, is that part of Walt's, how he saw the world? Was that his perspective? Just like Seinfeld. Like, Seinfeld is a story about nothing. It's about daily life, but it's through the perspective, through the narrative of Jerry and Larry David, but it's like through their eyes,
cynical.
We're seeing we're seeing the world. It's like, and that's what we're paying for, either through subscription or we're paying, through our attention, through our time spent watching it. And that's what makes it special, because how they see as something as boring as daily life on Seinfeld, like they would take something so boring and so just monotonous.
Brushing your teeth.
Yeah, and then they turn it into this interesting story. But even that, it's like it's not so much just a story, but their perspective on it. And I feel like that's where the magic happens. Like stories, like that's like you got into like a B. But when you introduce narrative and perspective to it, where that adds the magic, then you're in the A zone. Then you're in like the A+. And I feel like that's what even like you said, Mickey, Disneyland, like these incredible intellectual property that we've been able to experience throughout our lives. It's like we're able to see the world through someone's eyes, and you look at any, really, it's like I do think that's like the core of like Apple as well, and the innovation and all that. It's like, as some of the stories may be made up, but the legend of Steve Jobs, or even Richard Branson with Virgin, and how outlandish and crazy he is. It's like, that's what we're paying for when you do partake of like the Virgin brand.
Yeah. Or even so much, like sports franchises, teams, right? Big brands, the merchandise alone, millions of dollars in revenue and sales and everything else like that. And then the ticket price for people to go to a stadium or to watch their favorite sports team participate. Ultimately, it's the same. It's season after season. Someone wins, someone loses, someone rises to the top, wins the Super Bowl. Everyone's back down to square one next season. It resets. But every year, every season, it's a narrative that the sports fan is falling in love with, whether it's their favorite player who's doing great or having on injury list, or now he's back on, right? I come from a diehard Warriors household. Literally, I'm surprised that the TV hasn't been, it either is hugged or wanting to be kicked. It's a passionate form of entertainment. But even sports brands, and that's something that again is its own little thing. But it boils down to narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
Like literally in sports, you have narrators who are telling you the play-by-play and giving you their perspective on it. Like
Your
it's
team is either in a dynasty era and has won 3, championships
they're
back to back,
cursed.
or they're cursed and they haven't won something in 13 or 50 years.
Yeah.
And every year you come back rooting for the underdog, rooting to see him do it, and it's emotional and it's exhausting. And in the end, guess what? It happens all over again. In the end, it's for entertainment purposes, but it's a brand, it's story, and they go hand in hand. And whether it is a, multi-million-dollar hockey team, or it is a shoe brand, or it is they sell sunscreen, whatever it is, or barbecue sauce. You're having a narrative. The brand is utilizing some form of narrative to connect with the audience. It makes me even think back to like some of the things that some of the narratives that are so dear to my heart, whether it's Indiana Jones, right? Or somebody, and then I'm sitting there going, why am I such an Indiana Jones fan, right? I grew up on it. I was there. I mean, it's maybe because there's attributes of the character that I either see in myself or I relate to or I aspire to. So narrative is all about either relating or aspiring.
Yeah. And I feel like the narrative is it's that key to being able to express some of those things of what you care about, because you are sharing that perspective. And that's really only when we share our perspective with someone do we actually start making ground on actually having a relationship. Because with perspective does come either emotions or history of, hey, I have this perspective because of these things that have happened in my past or because of these beliefs. And like you said, it's like then people can relate on that, or the narrative is so legendary almost that then we go, man, I aspire for that. I want to be like LeBron James or Steve Jobs or Steph Curry. You have all these legends out there where, Steph Curry is out there shooting how many 3-pointers every single day. He was out there doing this, that. Michael Jordan, all these guys, they have these legends about them. And then you take that into the business world, the same thing. And I feel like that's really where it does come down to, there's a story, but the narrative that we choose to deliberately tell that aligns with not only our brand and our outlook, but also those people that we're trying to connect with. And that's the strategy of it.
Right. And the art of storytelling is primal. I mean, dates back to the early, we would sit around the fire and we would tell stories. That's how cultures have been passed down. That's how history has been before written text and before the internet and whatever. I mean, cultures have passed down their beliefs, their everything else through storytelling. Mm-hmm. And the bonding connection that brings us in humanity, we connect either through shared experience or shared values or shared aspirations. Maybe that's intrinsic in the brand, or maybe that's an association with the brand. Yeah. But that's really where the power is tapped into with narration.
And I feel like even with robotics right now and AI, you have like two camps where you have some people who think, oh man, this is going to lead to the end of the world. The robot's going to take over and it's going to be like Terminator. And then you have the other people who think, no, this is actually a huge moment for humans. This is going to lift up the lower class. This is going to solve a lot of problems. This is actually going to lead to that utopian world that we have always dreamed of. And really it's like optimist versus pessimist. But you look at even movies back in the days, like you had those two stories being told, and now you have the same story of robotics and AI advancing. That's the core story, but you have two different perspectives on it. And I've seen it, in Twitter and on social media where people are taking these sides on either, perspective 1 versus perspective 2. And you get that in, not only in advancements of technology in the future, but politics, opinions around the world. But there can be a central story, and then you have two perspectives on it. And I think that's where it's like those perspectives, they're based off of those beliefs, those values, and those really those narratives of how you see it, how you see that story. And that tells a lot of, where you're coming from. And like you said, it's a shared experience in a way, being able to have a narrative that aligns with someone because they're relating to that side of the story. And so it is almost like you lived through that experience together.
Yeah.
You're sharing that.
Yeah. And I think, and we touched on too, just the interesting phenomena is that the narrative is so powerful that it, at some point, what starts off as a narrative can become a unshakable brand in and of itself. Harry Potter, for instance, with and the filter by which the audience, the scrutiny.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That the audience can put through it. For instance, when HBO finally a couple years drops its 10-season plan to redo the Harry Potter books in film form, but through episodes on HBO Max, I'm personally I'm staying very hopeful, but there's going to be a lot of Potter fans that are going to be putting that under a very scrutinous lens and comparing it to either the writings of the books or to their expectations from the first films, the ones that to them are the ones they grew up on, the one that there's only ever going to be one Harry Potter, and that's Daniel Radcliffe.
Yeah, and in your example of Harry Potter, it makes me think of like they do it with Star Wars and everything like that. When there's new content that comes out and they go, oh, that's not part of the canon, or that doesn't fit this. It's interesting because it's almost like they're saying it doesn't fit the narrative that they've invested in, they've fallen in love with, and then they're going, wait, no, that doesn't fit. Like, that's not the same. You're changing. You're not really changing the story per se, but you're changing the narrative, how it's told. You're changing the
Exactly.
And I feel like that's what we even see with brands, where if a brand comes out with a campaign, like we've seen in the past, or a new logo or a new tone to it, the audience can react in a way that's going, wait, you're changing the narrative. You're changing the narrative that I've been so sold on and I've been a fan of, and now you're changing up the game.
Right. Like when Zack Snyder decided to portray Batman and capable of killing. And people are like, since the birth of Batman with DC Comics, they told us a particular story. And Batman as an enterprise, as a brand, right, is huge, has a very passionate following. And when people are like, Batman doesn't kill. And that is, and I've seen debates on Reddit. I've seen, where it's just so crazy when someone wants to take that narrative and just turn it slightly. The knee-jerk reaction of the fans is really just interesting to watch and to see how that plays in. And someone that's into brand, like we are, it's kind of, again, Batman is in itself a brand. And what's the reaction of the audience and the engagement of the audience when people are trying to mess with the brand?
Yeah. I think we've talked about this before with like Apple, where the innovation of Apple has been lacking, and the true fans and like Apple cult, they haven't been liking that at all. Ever since Steve Jobs passing away, it's like they've been so critical of Apple not being innovative and not pushing the envelope and doing these things, because I think they're arguing these slight iPhone updates or these slight Mac updates, they're not matching the narrative that they've fallen in love with, and that's what drew them to Apple, and that's what they've invested in, right? And that's what they've become fans of, and that's what they support. And the narrative is simply starting to slip where it's not matching that. And it's like I always try to relate brand stuff back to like humans, and it would be weird. Imagine you have a friend that you've known for years, and they start changing their perspective on things, or they start changing a couple of their morals. Like maybe it's a friend that he's always been honest, or she's always been super high integrity, and then you see her like steal something, and it would be this change in narrative of her life story where you're like, wait, why'd you do that? Right? It would push you off balance, where you would.
Maybe we didn't have anything in common to begin with.
Yeah, maybe she's been faking it. Like
the very nature of your relationship with that.
Yeah, the rug's been pulled, and now you're starting to. There's this uncertainty in it, because it's like the inconsistency is scary, but then it's like also what is real? What's my foundation anymore?
Right.
And I feel like it pulls into question so many different aspects of, on the human level, but also on the brand level, of these beliefs and these principles of, again, like even like with Nike, what they've gotten in trouble with, of doing some bad things with sweatshops across the pond, where it's like someone buying these things and loving Nike and then going, wait, I'm supporting something that I completely disagree with. And I didn't think Nike was like that, right? It's like it's a complete change of narrative of like, no, does that make me a bad person?
Right. Which then leads into the topic we've talked about in the past about rebranding. We're having to reposition, right? When a brand's having to make up for lost ground with its audience because of a corporate blunder, or the brand loses some of its luster, or it's not as great as it used to be, or the service used to be stellar, but now it just sucks.
Yeah.
You know, those are the things that unfortunately connect themselves and attach themselves to the brand's story, the brand's narrative.
Yeah.
And you have to recover from that. And so again, it's one of those things of maybe you as a brand need to slightly reposition the narrative that you are presenting to the consumer to make up for lost ground.
Yeah.
For wane in trust.
Yeah. Or even getting back on track with what that narrative was, historically, is that going, no, guys, we need to pull things back in, and we got off track. Now let's get back to what our true soul is as the brand. And that's what I remember when Mandalorian came out on Disney Plus, is that people loved that, and the fans loved it because it was true to the Star Wars narrative and true to so much about the story that then the fans were going nuts about it. Like,
and even the fact that they went back to more practical special effects and practical, it was almost like rebelling against so much of the over CGI'd movies of, say, the Star Wars prequels. Sorry, I'm totally.
You just made my point.
I'm totally geeking out right now, but. Where it was like they were so over CG'd, and literally when they went to make Mandalorian and said, the director said, I want to go back to the way George did creature design and the way they filmed the creatures in the original, then we embraced it as fans. We embraced it because to us it brought it back to what we loved about the first one.
But that's a good point of the actual execution of it, and relating this to like a business is like, how you do anything is how you do everything. So even George Lucas's, decision, his deliberate choice to do certain special effects a certain way. Of course, technology at the time was a little different, but even with Mandalorian, going back to that and respecting that narrative is the same thing in your business. Is going, okay, how does my narrative? How do we go about whether it is customer service? How do we answer the phone? How do we serve the table? How do we clean up the table? How do we treat our employees, or any of those aspects of the experience of the brand? But it also it shines a light on being deliberate in all those choices, because your story is one thing, but you being deliberate about your narrative along the way it's the same as, with Avatar or Lord of the Rings, and them choosing to actually develop this whole different world and these new creatures and these new languages and these new environments that you're inviting, the audience into. And just like with your business, you're inviting these people into your business to experience it. And that's really what's going to set you apart, is having that totally different. Whether you're selling burgers, the guy next to you selling burgers is telling the same story, but it's your decision in your advantage to actually, say the narrative differently and to use that to your success.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really, it's like you look at any of these hero journeys, and we hear about that so much. Oh, the hero's journey. It's like it is stories. Stories are simple. You have so many acts. You have the hero's journey. You have, like, Shakespeare breaks it down to either a tragedy or a comedy. Stories are stories, but the perspective and the narrative behind that is what makes them special.
There's a conflict in most stories. There's always a conflict, and usually it is how you overcome that conflict. And isn't that what all branding, marketing pitches are? There's something about it that it just goes back to story and a beginning, a conflict, and an end, resolution usually. Mm-hmm. And those are all primal things that we as humans connect with. That's why all the greatest stories ever told follow the same general path, right?
Yeah.
Whether they're named Frodo or Luke Skywalker, they are characters that are against the odds, or there is a dragon to slay, or a dragon to train.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, there's things to... many times it's just the packaging's different. but there's crucial story elements that we as humans just naturally connect with.
Yeah.
And if you start to understand those and can see those in your own life and the things that you're a fan of anyway, and why, and what about it draws you to that, and I'll bet a lot of the same type of signals are sent from some of the brands, the products and commercial brands, right, that you also cling to.
Yeah.
And there's something about it. There's an essence about it that just it connects on an emotional level. And that's, I think, if anything, if we had to distill this entire concept and episode down to one thing, it is emotionally connecting with the audience. And in this case, through a narrative.
Yeah. The story is always going to be there. The formation of the story, that's as old as time. But it's up to you and your uniqueness and your distinct perspective of being able to express that in its own narrative and take that, because there are going to be people who relate to that and who enjoy that and want to be part of that.
On that point, guys, we look forward to next time. Cheers.
Cheers.